Welcome to the Humanized Books channel. Today, we will continue series of mini-books, summaries on frames, influence, and negotiation. You are influenced more often than you realize. This audiobook reveals the psychological shortcuts guiding everyday decisions, showing how persuasion works when it crosses into manipulation, and how awareness gives you back choice, clarity, and calm control in a complex world. The number 2 book on the series is Influence, New and Expanded, The Psychology of Persuasion by Robert Cialdini, a doctor of philosophy. Let's go dive in the book. Introduction. Why do intelligent people say yes to things they later regret? Why does a small favor create a powerful sense of obligation? Why do crowds influence our judgment even when we believe we are thinking independently? And why do certain words, symbols, or authorities bypass our logic entirely? In Influence, Robert Cialdini explores a simple but unsettling truth. Much of human behavior is automatic. Not because we are foolish, but because the modern world is too fast, too complex, and too overloaded for constant deep thinking. To survive, the human mind relies on shortcuts. These shortcuts usually serve us well, but when they are intentionally triggered, they can be used to guide, shape, and sometimes manipulate our decisions. This mini-book is not about becoming manipulative. It is about becoming aware. Cialdini does not teach persuasion as a weapon, but as a system of psychological forces that operate whether we notice them or not. Once you understand these forces, you stop being surprised by your own behavior. You learn when to slow down, when to question, and when a simple yes deserves a second look. Chapter 1. The Levers of Influence, How Automatic Behavior is Triggered. Cialdini begins with a humbling idea. Humans are not always thoughtful decision makers. Much of the time, we operate on autopilot. This is not a flaw. It is a necessity. The human environment is overwhelmingly complex. Every day, we face thousands of decisions, signals, requests, and stimuli. If we analyzed each one deeply, we would be paralyzed. To function, the brain relies on mental shortcuts, also called heuristics. These shortcuts allow fast, efficient decisions with minimal effort. Most of the time, they work. The danger appears when a shortcut is activated in the wrong situation. Cialdini uses examples from animal behavior to explain this. Certain animals respond to a single trigger feature. When that feature appears, an entire behavior sequence activates automatically. The response is not thoughtful, it is mechanical. Humans, surprisingly, behave in similar ways. We have learned psychological trigger features that tell us when to trust, when to comply, and when to agree. Once triggered, we often respond without awareness. Cialdini calls this click-run behavior. The trigger clicks and the behavior runs. A classic example is the word because. Research shows that people are far more likely to comply with a request if it includes a reason, even if the reason adds no meaningful information. The mere structure of "do this because" often triggers compliance. The brain hears the cue and responds automatically. This does not mean people are stupid. It means the mind is conserving energy. Another powerful shortcut is expensive equals good. When people lack expertise, they use price as a signal of quality. This rule usually works well because price often correlates with value. But when price is artificially manipulated, perception follows. Cialdini shows that expectation alone can shape experience. When people believe something is more effective, they often experience it as such, even when the product is identical. Belief becomes reality. These shortcuts are not moral failures. They are survival strategies. The problem is that once someone understands these triggers, they can design situations that activate them intentionally. This is where influence professionals enter the picture. Salespeople, advertisers, fundraisers, recruiters, and political communicators learn which levers reliably produce compliance. They do not overpower us. They guide us. Often, we do not even notice. Cialdini introduces the idea of levers of influence. Psychological principles that, when activated, move behavior with very little effort. Pull the right lever, and a yes appears. This chapter sets the foundation for the entire book. Influence works not because people are weak, but because the mind is efficient. Awareness is the only defense. Once you know that automatic responses exist, you can begin to recognize when they are being triggered. That moment of recognition creates choice, and choice restores control. Chapter 2. Reciprocation, the rule that governs obligation. There is a rule so deeply woven into human culture that violating it feels wrong even when we do not know why. That rule is reciprocation. Cialdini describes reciprocation as one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior. It is the principle that says, when someone gives us something, we feel compelled to give something back. Not later, not conditionally, immediately. This rule is universal. It appears in every known culture across time and geography. Societies depend on it because it enables cooperation among individuals who are not related. Reciprocation creates trust where trust would otherwise be risky. Without it, social life would collapse. The problem is not that the rule exists. The problem is that it operates automatically. When the rule is activated, people feel a psychological pressure that is difficult to resist, even when the original gift was uninvited, unwanted, or trivial. Once obligation appears, logic weakens. Cialdini illustrates this with a striking pattern. People will often agree to a much larger request after receiving a small favor than they would have agreed to initially. The size of the returned favor does not need to match the size of the gift. Obligation, once triggered, drives behavior disproportionately. This is why free samples work. When someone receives something for free, the mind does not register marketing. It registers gift, and gifts demand repayment. This is why even a small gesture, a drink, a compliment, or a concession can change how people behave moments later. One of the most unsettling aspects of reciprocation is that it works even when we know it is being used. Cialdini describes studies where participants were aware that a favor was strategic, yet they still felt compelled to repay it. Awareness did not erase obligation. The rule bypassed conscious reasoning. This reveals something important. Reciprocation is not a moral decision, it is a social reflex. Another powerful variation of this rule is the rejection then retreat technique. Here, a large request is made first, expecting refusal. When it is rejected, a smaller request follows. The second request feels like a concession, and concessions trigger reciprocation. People feel obligated to respond kindly to perceived flexibility. The key insight is that reciprocation applies not only to gifts, but to behavior. When someone appears to compromise, we feel pressure to do the same. This is why skilled negotiators and persuaders often begin with positions they do not expect to win. The retreat creates obligation. Cialdini is careful to emphasize that this rule evolved for good reason. In everyday life, it keeps relationships balanced. It discourages freeloading. It encourages generosity. It builds long-term cooperation. But when used deliberately and strategically, it becomes a tool of influence. Another important detail is that obligation can override preference. People will comply with requests they dislike simply to discharge the feeling of debt. In some cases, they will do so even when the cost is high and the benefit unclear. The discomfort of owing feels worse than the discomfort of complying. This is why people say yes when they should pause. Cialdini also explains why refusing a gift can feel rude. The rule is so deeply internalized that rejecting the trigger itself creates discomfort. This makes the strategy especially effective in polite societies. Understanding reciprocation gives you two advantages. First, it helps you recognize when your sense of obligation is being activated artificially. When you feel sudden pressure to comply, ask yourself, did I receive something first? Was it unsolicited? Was it small but emotionally loaded? That moment of recognition restores choice. Second, it helps you use the rule ethically. Genuine generosity builds trust. Strategic generosity builds compliance. The difference lies in intention. Cialdini does not condemn influence. He insists on responsibility. The rule of reciprocation is powerful because it is invisible. It does not feel like pressure. It feels like decency. Once you understand that, you stop confusing obligation with agreement. You realize that a favor does not require a decision. It requires awareness. And awareness, once again, is the beginning of freedom. Chapter 3. Commitment and Consistency. Why small choices control big behavior. Human beings have a deep desire to appear consistent. Once we make a choice, take a stand, or express a belief, we feel pressure to behave in ways that align with that commitment. Cialdini identifies this drive for consistency as one of the strongest forces guiding human behavior, often without conscious awareness. Consistency feels like integrity. Inconsistency feels like weakness. Because of this, people often continue behaviors they no longer believe in simply to remain aligned with earlier decisions. The mind prefers harmony between actions and identity, even when that harmony is artificial. Cialdini shows that commitment does not need to be large to be powerful. In fact, small commitments are often more effective than big ones. Once someone takes a small step, their self-image shifts slightly. That shift creates pressure to act consistently with the new identity. A person who agrees to a small request begins to see themselves as cooperative, helpful, or supportive. When a larger request follows, saying no would conflict with that self-image. So they say yes. This is how small choices become traps. One of the most striking findings Cialdini presents is that written commitments are especially powerful. When people write something down, they take ownership of it. The act of writing makes the commitment feel deliberate and permanent, even if it was made casually. Public commitments are even stronger. When a belief or decision is expressed publicly, social pressure reinforces internal pressure. Backing out feels embarrassing. Staying consistent feels honorable. This is why public statements, pledges, and declarations are so effective at shaping future behavior. Cialdini explains that consistency works best when commitments are D. Active rather than passive, D. Public rather than private, D. Effortful rather than effortless. Each of these elements deepens psychological attachment. Another important insight is that consistency becomes self-reinforcing. Once people commit, they begin to generate reasons to justify that commitment, even if those reasons were not present initially. The mind rewrites history to support current behavior. This is not dishonesty, it is coherence seeking. People want to believe their actions make sense. So after committing, they selectively notice information that supports their choice and ignore information that contradicts it. Over time, belief hardens around behavior. Cialdini illustrates this with examples from sales, politics, and everyday life. People who agree to small symbolic acts often end up supporting causes far beyond their original intention. The initial step was minor. The consequences were not. This principle also explains why habits are difficult to break. Repeated behavior becomes part of identity. I am the kind of person who does this. Once identity is involved, logic alone struggles to intervene. Cialdini also highlights a darker implication: commitment can lock people into harmful paths. People persist in bad investments, unhealthy relationships, or flawed beliefs simply because they have already invested time, effort, or reputation. This is known as escalation of commitment. The mind reasons, I have come this far, so I must continue. Stopping would imply error, and error threatens identity. Understanding this principle provides protection. When you notice yourself justifying behavior primarily because you have already committed, pause. Ask whether consistency is serving reality or merely protecting ego. Awareness weakens the automatic pull of commitment. Cialdini also emphasizes ethical responsibility. Commitment and consistency can be used to help people build healthy habits, honor values, and follow through on meaningful goals. But they can also be used to trap people into actions they would not choose freely. The difference lies in transparency. This chapter teaches that the most dangerous commitments are the ones made casually. A small yes spoken without reflection can reshape behavior for years. Recognizing this gives you power. You learn to slow down before committing. You learn to treat small requests seriously. You learn that identity follows behavior, not the other way around. Consistency is not inherently virtuous. It is only valuable when aligned with truth. Once you understand this, you gain the freedom to change your mind without shame. And that freedom is rare. Chapter 4. Social Proof. Why we follow the crowd when we are unsure. When people are uncertain, they look outward. This is the central idea behind social proof. Cialdini explains that when we are unsure how to act, what to believe, or which choice is correct, we often decide by observing what others are doing. If many people behave a certain way, the behavior begins to feel correct. This shortcut is efficient. It is also dangerous. Social proof evolved as a survival mechanism. In unfamiliar situations, copying the behavior of others often leads to safe outcomes. If everyone runs in one direction, there may be a reason. If a group avoids something, it may be dangerous. Most of the time, this logic works. The problem arises when uncertainty is high and information is limited. In these moments, the crowd becomes the guide, even when the crowd is wrong. Cialdini shows that social proof becomes most powerful under two conditions: uncertainty and similarity. When we are unsure and the people around us seem similar to us, we are especially likely to follow their behavior. The mind assumes that people like us know something we do not. This is why testimonials are effective. This is why ratings influence decisions. This is why trends spread rapidly. One of the most unsettling aspects of social proof is that it can override personal judgment. People may ignore their own perceptions if they conflict with the group. Cialdini presents classic research showing that individuals will publicly agree with an obviously incorrect answer simply because everyone else does. The pressure is not explicit. It is psychological. The mind reasons that many people cannot all be wrong. And if they are, being wrong together feels safer than being right alone. Cialdini also discusses how social proof can lead to pluralistic ignorance. This occurs when individuals privately doubt a situation but assume others accept it. Because no one speaks up, the illusion of consensus persists. Each person waits for someone else to act. This phenomenon has serious consequences. In emergencies, people may fail to intervene because they see others doing nothing. Silence is interpreted as understanding. Inaction becomes confirmation. The crowd creates paralysis. Cialdini emphasizes that social proof does not require a large group. Even a small number of visible examples can trigger imitation. This is why marketing often highlights most popular options. It is why donation requests mention previous donors. It is why online platforms display views, likes, and shares. Numbers suggest correctness. Another important insight is that social proof works best when people are similar. Testimonials from people like you are more persuasive than expert opinions in uncertain contexts. Similarity increases trust. This explains why peer influence often outweighs authority in everyday decisions. Cialdini also warns that social proof can be manufactured. Fake reviews, staged crowds, and selective statistics exploit this shortcut. When people rely on behavior rather than evidence, they become vulnerable to manipulation. Understanding social proof allows you to pause when uncertainty appears. When you feel drawn toward a choice primarily because others are doing it, ask yourself what information you actually have. Ask whether the behavior is evidence or merely reassurance. This moment of reflection interrupts automatic imitation. Social proof is not inherently bad. It helps people coordinate, learn norms, and adapt quickly. But it becomes dangerous when used as a substitute for thinking rather than a source of information. Cialdini also highlights how social proof shapes identity. People adopt behaviors not only to be correct, but to belong. Agreement feels safe. Dissent feels risky. This emotional layer strengthens the effect. Recognizing this helps you understand when you are complying to avoid standing out rather than because something makes sense. The lesson of this chapter is not to reject the crowd automatically. It is to recognize when the crowd is influencing you silently. Awareness restores choice. When uncertainty rises, the pull of social proof strengthens. When awareness rises, its grip weakens. Understanding this principle helps you remain independent without becoming isolated. It allows you to observe behavior without surrendering judgment. And in a world driven by visibility and numbers, that skill is essential. Chapter 5. Liking. Why familiarity opens the door to influence. People prefer to say yes to those they like. This principle sounds obvious, almost trivial, but Cialdini shows that liking is one of the most quietly powerful forces in persuasion. It does not feel like pressure. It feels like comfort. And because it feels natural, it often goes unnoticed. Liking works because trust follows familiarity. When we like someone, we lower our defenses. We listen more generously. We interpret their intentions more positively. We give them the benefit of the doubt. This happens automatically, long before logic evaluates the situation. Cialdini identifies several factors that reliably increase liking. The first is similarity. We like people who resemble us. Similar background, interests, values, experiences, or even small preferences create a sense of connection. When someone feels familiar, we assume shared understanding. That assumption creates trust even when evidence is limited. This is why influence professionals often highlight similarities early. not to deceive, but to create rapport. The danger appears when similarity substitutes for substance. We begin agreeing not because something makes sense, but because it comes from someone who feels like us. The second factor is praise. Compliments, even when vague or exaggerated, increase liking. The mind responds positively to affirmation. Cialdini notes that praise does not need to be accurate to be effective. Even when we suspect flattery, it still shapes perception. Praise lowers resistance, it creates goodwill, and goodwill opens the door to compliance. The third factor is familiarity through repeated exposure. The more often we encounter someone, the more comfortable they feel. This effect, known as the mere exposure effect, explains why repeated advertising works even when we do not consciously pay attention. Familiarity feels safe. Safety feels trustworthy. Cialdini also highlights association. We like people who are connected to things we like. Success, happiness, beauty, authority, and popularity all transfer through association. When someone positions themselves near positive symbols, some of that positivity spills over. This is why endorsements work. It is why brands align with admired figures. It is why people casually mention shared connections. The unsettling insight is that liking often overrides content. We may accept arguments from people we like that we would reject from strangers. We may overlook flaws. We may fail to ask hard questions. Liking does not change reality, it changes attention. Cialdini emphasizes that this principle is not inherently manipulative. Liking is fundamental to human connection. Relationships depend on it. Cooperation depends on it. The problem arises when liking replaces evaluation. Influence becomes effortless when defenses are down. Cialdini includes reader reports where people realized they had agreed to unfavorable terms simply because the person asking was friendly, charming, or relatable. The request did not change. The messenger did. This chapter offers an important protective insight. Separate the person from the proposal. When you feel warmth, pause. Ask whether the decision makes sense independent of who is asking. Liking should invite conversation, not bypass judgment. Cialdini also encourages ethical awareness. Building genuine rapport is not wrong. Using liking to hide poor offers or manipulate emotion is. The responsibility lies with the influencer to act transparently and with the influenced to remain aware. Understanding liking does not mean becoming suspicious of friendliness. It means recognizing when emotional comfort is doing cognitive work. You can appreciate someone and still evaluate their request. You can enjoy connection without surrendering judgment. Liking makes influence feel human. Awareness makes it fair. Chapter 6. Authority. Why we obey without thinking. From a very early age, we are taught a simple lesson: listen to authority. Parents, teachers, doctors, leaders, experts. Authority figures help societies function. They transmit knowledge efficiently. They reduce uncertainty. They allow us to act without having to personally verify every fact. Cialdini emphasizes that this tendency is not weakness, it is efficiency. But like every shortcut, authority can be misused. The principle of authority states that people are far more likely to comply with requests when they come from someone who appears to possess expertise, status, or power. The appearance alone is often enough. Actual competence is secondary. This is one of the most unsettling findings in the book. Cialdini presents research showing that people will follow instructions from authority figures even when those instructions conflict with their own judgment. In some cases, they will do so despite clear discomfort. The authority cue overrides internal hesitation. What makes this principle especially powerful is that authority does not always speak. Often, it signals itself visually. Uniforms, titles, credentials, symbols, formal language, and competent tone all trigger authority responses. A lab coat suggests expertise. A suit suggests status. A title suggests knowledge. Once the signal appears, the mind shifts into compliance mode. This is why people defer automatically. Cialdini explains that we are conditioned to believe that authorities know better. Questioning them feels inefficient or disrespectful. Obedience becomes the default, not because we agree, but because we trust the system. The danger appears when symbols replace substance. People often comply without verifying whether the authority is relevant, legitimate, or competent in the specific context. An expert in one field may be treated as an authority in another. Confidence may be mistaken for knowledge. Formal appearance may be mistaken for credibility. Cialdini includes examples where individuals followed authority cues that were completely fabricated. Fake credentials, staged titles, and confident delivery produce compliance, even when the advice was poor or harmful. The lesson is clear: authority bypasses scrutiny. Cialdini does not argue that authority should be rejected. He argues that it should be examined. The key question is not, is this person an authority, but is this person an authority here? This distinction restores balance. Another important insight is that authority pressure can silence moral judgment. When responsibility feels transferred upward, individuals feel less accountable for their actions. "I was just following instructions" becomes a psychological shield. Understanding this helps explain how ordinary people participate in harmful systems without malicious intent. Authority diffuses responsibility. Cialdini also highlights that authority works best when combined with other principles. An authority figure who is liked, socially validated, or scarce becomes especially persuasive. Influence multiplies when principles stack. Recognizing authority cues gives you protection. When you feel compelled to comply because someone seems important, pause. Ask what qualifies them. Ask whether their expertise applies. Ask whether the decision aligns with evidence or merely hierarchy. This pause breaks automatic obedience. Authority can be a guide. It should not be a substitute for thinking. Cialdini also stresses ethical responsibility for those in authority. Influence increases with perceived power. So does responsibility. Using authority to clarify and educate strengthens trust. Using it to coerce or mislead corrodes it. The goal is not rebellion. The goal is awareness. When you understand how authority operates, you can respect expertise without surrendering judgment. You can learn efficiently without becoming passive. And in a world filled with credentials, titles, and confident voices, that distinction matters. Chapter 7. Scarcity. Why what is limited feels more valuable. Few psychological forces move people as quickly as scarcity. When something appears limited, rare, or about to disappear, desire intensifies. Objects feel more valuable. Opportunities feel urgent, decisions feel heavier. Cialdini shows that scarcity does not merely increase interest, it changes how we think. Scarcity shifts attention. When availability is limited, the mind focuses narrowly on what might be lost. Alternatives fade. Risks feel smaller, benefits feel larger. The fear of missing out begins to outweigh careful evaluation. This reaction is automatic. Cialdini explains that scarcity evolved as a survival mechanism. Limited resources required fast action. Hesitation could mean loss. In environments of uncertainty, urgency protected survival. But in modern contexts, this instinct is often triggered artificially. Scarcity does not need to be real to be effective. It only needs to feel real. Limited time offers, exclusive access, countdowns, and phrases like "last chance" activate this principle instantly. The mind interprets restriction as value. If something is hard to get, it must be worth having. Cialdini presents research showing that people assign greater value to items simply because they are scarce, even when the item itself has not changed. Availability alters perception more than quality. This effect intensifies when scarcity is sudden. When access is removed unexpectedly, desire spikes. People want what they believe they can no longer have. This is why last-minute deadlines and disappearing options are so effective. Loss feels more urgent than gain. Cialdini connects this to loss aversion. Humans experience losses more strongly than gains of equal size. Scarcity frames decisions as potential losses rather than potential benefits. This emotional framing accelerates compliance. Another important insight is that scarcity works especially well when combined with competition. When people believe others are competing for the same limited resource, urgency increases further. Now the decision is not just about value, but about status. Winning feels important. Losing feels personal. This is why auctions escalate. This is why exclusive lists attract attention. This is why popularity amplifies scarcity. Cialdini also discusses reactance, the psychological response to perceived restriction of freedom. When people feel their options are being limited, they react by wanting the restricted option more strongly. Scarcity feels like a threat to autonomy. The mind responds by reclaiming freedom through desire. This explains why forbidden items, banned ideas, or restricted access often become more attractive. The restriction itself fuels interest. Cialdini includes examples where people were more persuaded by arguments after learning that access to the information was limited or censored. Scarcity increased perceived importance regardless of content quality. The danger of scarcity is that it accelerates decision-making precisely when slowing down would be wiser. Urgency compresses thinking. People skip evaluation. They accept terms they would normally question. They commit emotionally before fully understanding consequences. Cialdini emphasizes that scarcity is not inherently dishonest. Some things truly are limited. Time, energy, attention, and opportunity are real constraints. Scarcity becomes problematic when it is used to replace judgment rather than inform it. Awareness is the defense. When you feel sudden urgency, ask what has changed. Has the value increased or has availability decreased? Are you responding to substance or to pressure? This pause interrupts automatic compliance. Cialdini also encourages ethical use of scarcity. When scarcity is real, it should be communicated clearly, without exaggeration. Artificial urgency may work short-term, but it erodes trust long-term. This final principle completes the system. Scarcity pushes us to act. Authority tells us who to trust. Liking lowers resistance. Social proof guides uncertainty. Commitment locks behavior. Reciprocation creates obligation. Together, these principles explain much of human compliance. Understanding scarcity allows you to slow down when urgency appears. It restores choice when pressure spikes. It helps you distinguish between genuine opportunity and manufactured haste. Scarcity does not mean value, it means limited access. Knowing the difference gives you back control. Conclusion: awareness is the real advantage. Influence works not because people are weak, but because the mind is efficient. Throughout this mini-book, one truth appears again and again. Human behavior is often guided by shortcuts. These shortcuts save time, reduce effort, and help us function in a complex world. But when they are activated deliberately, without our awareness, they quietly take control of our decisions. Reciprocation makes obligation feel like decency. Commitment makes identity feel permanent. Social proof makes crowds feel correct. Liking makes familiarity feel trustworthy. Authority makes symbols feel true. Scarcity makes urgency feel meaningful. None of these principles are inherently harmful. They exist because they usually help us navigate life. The danger appears only when they replace thinking rather than support it. Robert Cialdini's work does not ask us to become suspicious of everyone. It asks us to become aware of ourselves. Awareness slows reaction. It restores choice. It creates space between impulse and decision. Once you recognize these forces, you are no longer surprised by your own behavior. You begin to notice when pressure is psychological rather than practical. You learn when to pause, when to question, and when a simple yes deserves more time. Influence does not disappear when you understand it. It becomes visible, and visibility is the beginning of freedom. If this audiobook challenged how you think, support the work by subscribing, liking, and sharing your thoughts below. Comments shape future content. Stay curious, stay aware, and return for deeper explorations into psychology, influence, and the hidden forces guiding decisions. All the best, and take care of yourselves.